Okay, let's talk a little bit about diabetes. So, first of all, diabetes is a really important health concern. Diabetes is on the rise, has been for many years now, especially as much more of the world over the past, 100 years or so, has moved into kind of what we would consider like post-scarcity economies and like economic situations. For millions of years, human beings and our ancestors didn't get enough food for the most part. Now we have a problem where we have all the access to food in the world, in many parts of the world, and we have access to too much food. And so that's one of the causes of the fact that diabetes is on the rise. Over 400 million adults in the world have diabetes. Every year there are maybe 1.5 million people who die of diabetes-related complications. It's about 1 in 11 people have diabetes of some sort. And diabetes is a pretty significant health concern, like I said. Millions of people die from it, and the reasons for that is because diabetes can lead to things like strokes, heart attacks, kidney failures, all of which can lead to death, but also other problems too that won't necessarily kill you, things like blindness, amputation, increased risk of injuries being untreated that people don't know about because they can't feel their limbs, for example. All these are problems associated with diabetes. So let's talk a little bit about how diabetes develops. What is diabetes and why is it such a concern? So first of all, we want to talk a little bit about how we go about diagnosing diabetes. So we're going to go through and we're going to test some different patients after we learn a little bit of the background and figure out, do they have diabetes or not, and what kind of diabetes do they have? And the way that is done is through what's called glucose tolerance testing, where basically you give a person glucose, a glucose solution after they've been fasting. You have them drink that, and then you just record every so often, record their blood sugar levels. There's also insulin testing where you do the same sort of thing. So at the same time you test the blood sugar levels, you also test them for insulin in their bloodstream. So they drink that solution, and then we test that at regular intervals. And based on the results of those tests, we can figure out if somebody is diabetic or not, and also what type of diabetes they might have. So there are two main types of diabetes, but there's a third one. We won't talk about it too much, but I'll at least touch on it a little bit here. So there's type 1 diabetes, and in type 1 diabetics, these patients, their bodies just don't produce enough insulin. They might not produce any insulin at all. Then there's type 2 diabetics. These are a little bit different. These people do produce insulin, but their bodies just can't use it. Their bodies don't respond to the insulin the way that they should. And then there's gestational diabetes. And this is usually, not always though, usually temporary condition similar to type 2 diabetes that occurs in pregnancy. Now, most of the time, a pregnant woman who has gestational diabetes, after the birth and after the pregnancy has concluded and as their body kind of starts getting back to normal, then that usually goes away. But not always. Sometimes it just persists, and that person now has type 2 diabetes. All right, so I've already talked a little bit about insulin. You've probably heard about insulin before. If you know somebody who's diabetic, you probably know that they take insulin, right? So what is it? Well, insulin is a hormone, and hormones are just chemical messengers within the body, right? That the pancreas produces, and it's really important for regulating blood sugar levels, so blood glucose. So glucose, that monosaccharide we talked about in the last video, that is the main sugar that is transported around the blood, supplies the cells with energy for cellular respiration, right, for the mitochondria to break that down to make ATP, really important molecule. But it's important that we have the right amount of glucose in our bloodstream. Not enough blood sugar is bad. Too much blood sugar is also bad. So I already mentioned, that's what hormones do, right? They travel from one place to another, and basically it's a way that the body can communicate with itself. And what insulin's message that it tells the cells to do, right, as a messenger molecule, as a hormone, is to absorb glucose from the bloodstream. So if a cell receives an insulin signal, that insulin binds onto a receptor on the cell membrane of that cell should respond by letting glucose in from the blood into the cell. That's what should happen. So we can see that with this graph right here. So this is a graph of glucose levels and insulin levels over time throughout like an average day. So the red line here, okay, you can see that red line tapering off here. Those are blood glucose levels, and this is our y-axis for blood glucose. You see this is a graph that actually has two y-axes. The other one is over here on the right. This is for serum insulin levels. And these are in different units because the amount of insulin in the bloodstream is very small compared to the amount of glucose. So this is in millimoles per liter. This is in picomoles per liter. Don't worry too much about the units. Just know that they are on different scales here, okay? Always important whenever you're looking at a graph, right? Check out your axes. Y-axis here on the left, another y-axis here on the right, and then we have along our x-axis, we have time of day. So throughout the day here, you can see when this person was having their meals, right? Here's breakfast. You can see that blood glucose goes up, and so does insulin. And that drops back down. They both drop back down. The insulin is going to tell the cells to bring in that glucose. And so when that blood sugar rises, that insulin is going to tell it to bring it right back down to a more normal level, right? So we want to keep it around this level. We don't want it way too high. You can see the same thing happening at lunch and dinner. Now in the middle here, they've tried to illustrate something where we have a difference between a starch-rich food and a sucrose-rich food. So basically, is this a meal with a lot of complex carbohydrates, okay, like starches, right? We talked about that, how it's a polysaccharide in the last video. Or is it a lot of simple sugars? Is it pasta or is it candy and Coca-Cola, right? And you can see the difference in how the blood sugar and insulin levels respond to those two different things. When we have the solid line, the starch-rich food, maybe some pasta and some whole grains, some nice bread, right? You can see that there, of course, there is a spike in the blood sugar levels, but it's not as high as if somebody has a bunch of simple sugars. So really high sucrose-rich foods, things like sugary snacks and drinks, your giant Starbucks latte or your energy drinks or what have you. They're going to spike the blood sugar up higher. These are considered to be higher glycemic index foods. And exposing your body to a lot of high glycemic index foods all the time, that's one of the risk factors for developing type 2 diabetes. So in general, while your body, of course, needs carbohydrates, and you need to make sure that you are eating carbohydrates, we don't want to be eating too many carbs. And when we do, we want to try to make sure that most of those are complex carbs. Things, like starch, things that include fiber, not just simple sugars that spike your blood sugar and then cause a crash. Because you also see that happening here too. In addition to the spike, because the blood sugar level is so high, the body kind of overreacts and produces too much insulin, and that causes the blood sugar to dip way down here. This is why if you have a bunch of sugar at one point in the day, you might then get really tired a couple hours later. That's what we call a crash. So we see that blood sugar is crashing way down. This blood sugar is crashed way down, so way down below what it is here for this person when they're sleeping. They haven't eaten for a long time. So that's something that high glycemic index foods can do. And that kind of cycle where the body's overproducing insulin, that can lead to insulin insensitivity, which can eventually lead to type 2 diabetes. Okay, so like I said, the way that we diagnose diabetes is we do glucose tolerance testing, or GTT, and then we also do insulin testing. And those numbers, based on how they turn out over the course of the testing, can help us diagnose somebody whether they have diabetes or not. So what we're hoping to see is glucose levels stay below 140 milligrams per deciliter. That's considered normal. And you can see that here represented with this blue line here. This is a glucose tolerance testing glucose levels for a patient who does not have diabetes. So here's where they drink that glucose solution. You see their blood sugar does go up, but it doesn't go up too terribly high. It goes up to maybe 125 or so, and then it comes back down. Now, somebody who does have diabetes, those glucose levels are going to rise, and they're going to keep rising. Okay, above 140 to 200, in that 140 to 200 range, we consider that to be pre-diabetic, meaning that they are likely to develop diabetes in the future, especially if no changes are made. And above 200, like you see here, getting up above the 200 mark, that's when we consider a patient to be diabetic. If they drink that glucose solution, and their glucose levels get above 200, we say they do have diabetes. And you can also look at insulin levels for this as well. These insulin levels, by the way, are for type 2 diabetes, not type 1. Type 1, of course, These people make very small amounts of diabetes. But people with type 2 diabetes actually make excess insulin. And they're actually producing more insulin than normal because their bodies are resistant to that signal and they don't respond properly. The pancreas overcompensates and produces even more insulin because it's like, why aren't the blood sugar levels dropping? Why are the blood sugar levels dropping? And so the pancreas, because it's detecting and monitoring the blood sugar levels, right, the glucose in the blood, as long as that blood sugar still stays high, it's going to keep making insulin. And so this kind of leads to a vicious cycle where even more insulin is produced and the cells of the body continue to ignore it. Okay, so let's take a look at some testing results here. So this is patient A. And with patient A, when we're looking at this graph, once again, anytime you read a graph, check out your axes, right? Here we've got time on the x-axis. And then we again have two y-axes, just like before, right? We got our glucose on the left and our insulin levels on the right. And then our key at the bottom tells us that the dashed blue is glucose and the orange is insulin. So we can see here, though, that insulin levels are at 0. And glucose levels getting up to 250. So glucose above 200, this person has diabetes. Now the question is, what type of diabetes? This patient has type 1 diabetes because they don't produce any insulin at all. So as a reminder, type 1 diabetes, usually a genetic condition. It's often actually caused by an autoimmune disorder, an autoimmune reaction where the immune system of the body, for one reason or another, attacks the cells of the pancreas that produce insulin. They're called beta cells. The immune system kills off all the beta cells and that person's pancreas can't produce insulin. So this patient would have type 1 diabetes. Okay, let's go on to patient B. Okay, so patient B, if you look, glucose levels, very similar to our last patient, right? Getting up above 200, up to 250. So once again, this patient does have diabetes. But here you see that their insulin levels are actually quite high. Insulin levels are getting up into the 400 range, well above 100. So this patient, obviously, we have both of these indicators telling us they have diabetes, and they would have type 2 diabetes because they do produce insulin. In fact, they produce more than normal. All right, finally, let's look at patient C. Okay, so patient C, we see that they make insulin. We see that their glucose levels are getting up to 200, but not really going above, right? So depending on how you interpret these results, this patient, you could say they might be diabetic, they might have pre-diabetes. Obviously, their insulin levels are getting quite high. The glucose levels aren't getting that high, but they're right on the borderline. So this could be a pre-diabetic to diabetes, somewhere in that range here for patient C. All right, so a little bit of a breakdown of how insulin signaling actually works at the cellular level. This will be the last slide when we talk about here in this video. So what actually happens when insulin is produced by the pancreas, by those beta cells in the pancreas, and it flows into the blood, is that the insulin will bind onto a receptor at the cell membrane. So here is our cell membrane of a cell. This could be a muscle cell, it could be a fat cell, it could be any cell of the body really, but let's just call it a muscle cell. Right? Muscles need a lot of glucose, so they often are what's bringing in a lot of blood sugar. So do nerve cells and a whole variety, right? Anyway, call it a muscle cell. I'm actually going to move myself down here. So when the insulin is out there in the bloodstream, because a bunch of glucose is in the bloodstream from a meal, right? This glucose needs a way to get into the cell. Glucose is a big, fairly large molecule compared to other molecules, and it can't squeeze between the phospholipids. It's just too big. So it needs a way in. And so what insulin does is insulin binds onto this receptor protein, and this receptor protein initiates a cascade of signals and signaling reactions that take place within the cytoplasm of the cell down here. And there's a whole bunch of different molecules and processes and reactions that all happen here, and I've cut all those out of the diagram and just summarized it by basically saying there's a series of chemical signals, and eventually those chemical signals tell a vesicle that's down in the cytoplasm that contains these GLUT4 proteins to move up to the cell membrane, move out to the cell membrane and merge with it. And this delivers these GLUT4 proteins to the surface of the cell. And these GLUT4 proteins, these are transport proteins that allow glucose to pass in. So they're just the right shape, the right size, and that glucose can then diffuse from where it's highly concentrated out in the bloodstream to where it's less concentrated in the cytoplasm of the cell. So this is facilitated diffusion, like you've learned about in biology class, one of our types of transport. It's a type of passive transport, right? Going from high concentration to low concentration. This doesn't require any energy, and it brings that glucose in. So those GLUT4 transport proteins, they're not always just hanging out at the surface of the cell. They only go to the surface of the cell when the cell receives an insulin signal. And so in a person who is a type 1 diabetic, if they don't produce insulin, then this receptor will not get activated by the insulin. This series of chemical reactions will happen, and those transport proteins won't go to the surface of the cell. And so the glucose won't move into the cell, and it'll just stay in the bloodstream. And then that high concentration of sugar in the bloodstream causes all kinds of problems. So it makes the blood a little bit more hypertonic. It dehydrates the inner linings of the blood vessels, leading to damage, leading to things like atherosclerosis. It can also damage nerve cells, leading to something called neuropathy. And that neuropathy can lead to people like injuring their feet and their limbs and not knowing about it. It can lead to like circulation issues. It can damage the kidneys. Basically, this extra blood, all it is extra sugar in the blood. But that extra sugar in the blood makes that blood a little bit too hypertonic compared to the cells of the body. And it does a whole host of damaging things to the body. Now, type 2 diabetic, similar results, just a different way we get there, right? Type 2 diabetics, as a reminder, they produce insulin, but the problem is that for one reason or another, and it can possibly be different with different people, either this receptor protein doesn't work properly, maybe there's not enough receptor proteins, maybe the receptor protein works, but there's something down in this signaling cascade that doesn't work. But one way or another, you don't get all of those transport proteins to the surface. And again, the sugar hangs out in the bloodstream, doing all that damage. That'll do it for this video.